The sun was already low over the rugged ridges of the Sonoran Desert when the team of archaeologists, dusty and weary from hours of careful excavation, called out to Mara Tan. She had been standing at the mouth of the narrow limestone cave, reviewing maps and cataloguing the day's finds, when she heard the tremor in their voices. Stepping inside, she had to duck under jagged stone and squeeze past a curtain of ancient stalactites before emerging into the dim chamber where they stood. The air was cool and heavy, scented faintly of damp earth. There, on a bed of fine, undisturbed sand, lay a small gleam of silver catching the beam of a headlamp. One of the archaeologists knelt, brushing away grains of dust with a soft brush until the curved shape emerged fully. Mara crouched beside him, her heart quickening. It was a bracelet, delicate yet sturdy, the silver dulled with time, but still carrying the craftsmanship of care. She turned it over gently in her gloved hand, and that was when she saw it, the faint but unmistakable engraving inside the band. For Lena, love Mum. For a moment, she could not breathe. The cave, the murmured voices of the archaeologists, the faint hiss of wind at the entrance, all seemed to fade into silence as the name burned into her thoughts. Lena Tan, her Lena Tan. The bright-eyed 12-year-old Filipino-Malaysian girl who had vanished during a family road trip in the summer of 1990. Mara had been just 17 then, old enough to remember every detail of the heat-baked roads, the smell of petrol at the last stop before everything went wrong, and the way her sister's laughter had danced through the car that morning. No trace of Lena had ever been found despite months of searching, years of leads that went nowhere, and the gnawing ache of decades without answers. Mara's fingers trembled as she held the bracelet closer to the light, tracing the letters with the tip of her glove. She remembered the day their mother had given it to Lena, a birthday morning in their Manila apartment, the smell of jasmine tea and buttered toast in the air, and Lena's delighted gasp as she clasped it around her wrist. Mara could picture it so clearly now, gleaming against her sister's warm brown skin. How had it come to be here, in a cave miles from the highway where Lena disappeared? She glanced at the archaeologists, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease, sensing that this was not just another artifact to be catalogued and stored. This was a thread to a story long left frayed, and it had just been placed in Mara's hands. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, whistling low through the rocks, and Mara felt the old pull in her chest. The relentless urge that had driven her into investigative work, the promise she had made at 17 that she would not stop until she knew the truth. Now, for the first time in 34 years, she had something real. Not a rumor, not a shadow, but a piece of her sister returned from the silence. Surya Tan sat by the window of her small Manila apartment, the late afternoon light spilling across the lace curtains and settling on the neat rows of suitcases stacked against the wall. At 63, her frame had grown slender and her movements measured, but her eyes retained the steady, unwavering glow of a woman who had not surrendered to time's demands. Every year, without fail, she returned to Arizona, retracing the same desert highways where her eldest daughter, Lena, had vanished in the summer of 1990. For 34 years, she had carried the same battered leather bag on those trips, its lining worn thin from countless plane rides, always packed with the same few items. A framed school photo of Lena in her grade 6 uniform, the original police report folded so many times it had become soft as cloth, and a small sachet of jasmine petals that had long since lost their scent. Her hair, once black as midnight, was now streaked with silver, tied back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and her voice, though softened with age, held a quiet strength when she spoke of her daughter. She refused to hold a memorial, refused to let the world declare Lena gone, because to do so would feel like closing a door she still stood inside, calling her child's name. Friends had long since stopped asking why she kept going back. Some called it admirable. Others whispered it was a kind of madness. Surya paid them no mind. She had learned over the decades that grief was not a single wound to be healed, but a season that settled into a life and returned in its own rhythm, year after year. When Mara called from Arizona with the news about the bracelet, Surya listened in silence, her hand tightening around the receiver until her knuckles blanched. The weight of hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed again in her chest, the way it had in those first frantic weeks after Lena's disappearance, when she had searched every roadside motel, every gas station, every stretch of sand that might hide a clue. She remembered standing under the punishing desert sun in 1990, her throat raw from calling Lena's name into empty air, refusing to leave until the police had to guide her back to their cruiser. Even now, as the decades had carved lines into her face and slowed her step, she remained tethered to that road, to that moment. She would board the flight to Arizona in 2 days, her heart braced for whatever the desert had to show her. The bracelet was not just silver and engraving. It was proof that something of Lena had endured, hidden in stone and silence all these years, waiting for her to find it. As the light in the room shifted toward evening, Surya rose, her voice low but certain as she whispered into the empty air, as though speaking directly to her daughter. "I am coming, Lena. I am coming." The summer heat in the Arizona desert in 1990 shimmered off the endless asphalt, making the road ahead ripple like a mirage as the tan family car rolled steadily toward Phoenix. Surya sat in the passenger seat, her silk headscarf pulled loosely around her neck, trying to fan herself with a folded tourist map, while Ahmad kept both hands on the wheel, humming softly to the radio. In the back seat, Lena leaned against the window, her camera strap wrapped twice around her wrist, clicking pictures of the jagged mountains in the distance, while her 8-year-old brother Noel fiddled with a pack of playing cards. They had left Tucson that morning, the air still cool before the sun climbed high, but now the desert was a furnace, and when they spotted the faded sign for a roadside diner, everyone agreed it was time to stop. The diner was small, with chipped red booths and the smell of coffee that had been brewing too long, but it offered air conditioning and a break from the relentless glare. Surya and Ahmad ordered lunch for the family, and Lena, restless, asked if she could step outside to take a few photos before the food arrived. Ahmad waved her off with a smile, telling her not to wander far, and she nodded, camera swinging at her side as she pushed through the heavy glass door into the bright afternoon. It was the last time Surya saw her daughter. When the plates of sandwiches and fries arrived 10 minutes later, Lena's seat was still empty. At first, Surya thought nothing of it, assuming Lena had gotten caught up photographing a cactus bloom or a passing truck. But when another 10 minutes passed, her chest tightened. She stepped outside, calling her daughter's name into the dry wind, scanning the dusty lot where their car sat alone, the heat waves making everything seem to sway. The waitress said she had seen Lena near the side of the building, pointing her camera towards something behind the diner. But when Surya rounded the corner, there was nothing but a stretch of gravel and the shimmer of desert beyond. Within an hour, local police were there, combing the area on foot and in cruisers, their radios crackling with instructions. For weeks they searched, helicopters tracing lazy circles overhead, volunteers trudging through arroyos, officers knocking on doors in nearby towns. But not a single piece of evidence was found. Whispers began to spread, quiet at first, then sharper, that Ahmad's past business dealings had tied him to men who moved more than legitimate goods across the border. Old acquaintances spoke to reporters, hinting about debts and favors owed, and soon the police began to look at him differently. Ahmad denied it all, his voice breaking in interviews, but the unspoken accusation clung to him like dust. By the end of the summer, the search had dwindled, the reporters had moved on, and the desert kept its silence, holding Lena somewhere beyond reach. By the spring of 1992, The desert winds had long since swept over the footprints, tire tracks, and faint traces of the frantic search that had once consumed every waking hour of the Arizona authorities. The case files on Lena Tan, once thick with tip-offs, eyewitness statements, and investigative notes, had grown thin and stale, the pages curling at the corners from being thumbed through too many times with no result. Each lead that had once seemed promising had dissolved into nothing, the trail evaporating like rain on the blistering pavement. For Ahmad, the weight of the whispers proved too much to bear. Every time he walked into a store or stepped into the small mosque in their Tucson neighborhood, he could feel eyes on him, hear the pauses in conversation, sense the judgment in the way people lowered their voices. The insinuations about debts, smuggling, and dangerous men trailed after him like an unshakable shadow. By the end of that year, he boarded a flight back to Malaysia, telling Surya it was better this way, that she and Noel would be spared the constant suspicion if he were no longer there to draw it toward them. Surya did not follow. Her resolve was a quiet flame that refused to go out, even as her marriage fractured under the strain. She remained in the United States, moving with Noel to a smaller apartment on the edge of town, taking work wherever she could find it while saving every spare dollar to fund her own small searches. She visited the sheriff's office once a month, asking if there was any news, scanning the faces of new officers in case one might take a fresh interest in her daughter's case. Lena's disappearance, once a fixture on local news bulletins, began to slip from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher stories. Still, it lingered in the public memory, not because of any resolution, but because of its haunting incompleteness. People spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it one of Arizona's most unsettling mysteries, a story that seemed to belong as much to the desert's endless silence as to any human telling. Noel, barely 9 when Lena vanished, learned to navigate the delicate dance of being the sibling left behind, offering his mother comfort he was too young to fully understand. Surya kept every flyer, every photograph, every article about the case, stored in a weathered trunk at the foot of her bed. At night, she would sometimes sit with the trunk open, running her hands over the worn paper, willing herself to believe that somewhere, somehow, Lena might still be alive. The years between 1992 and the decades that followed stretched like the desert horizon, long, unchanging, and full of spaces where answers should have been. Yet in Surya's mind, the search never truly ended. It simply shifted into a quieter, more relentless form, a promise to her daughter that she would never stop looking, no matter how much time passed. The Arizona State Police evidence room was colder than Mara expected, the air humming faintly with the constant vibration of fluorescent lights overhead. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the distance, each lined with carefully labeled boxes, some coated in a fine layer of dust that hinted at years without disturbance. An officer led her through the aisles until they reached a table where a small, clear evidence bag lay under a strip of bright light. Inside, resting against the crinkled plastic, was the silver bracelet she had last seen in a photograph sent from the archaeological team. Even through the barrier of the bag, she could make out the delicate engraving inside the band. For Lena, love Mum. The letters softened by time, but still unmistakable. The officer explained in a low voice that the bracelet had been logged only a week earlier, hand-delivered by the team who had discovered it while surveying a remote cave system for indigenous rock art. They had been several days into their work when one of them spotted the glint of metal half buried in a pocket of sand deep within a narrow chamber. The officer emphasized how far in it was, a place that would be nearly impossible for casual hikers to reach without specialized gear or a deliberate purpose. The path into the cave was a twisting sequence of low ceilings, sharp turns, and sudden drops, the kind of terrain that demanded experience and intention. What struck Mara most was the fact that the cave was not marked on any public maps. Its entrance was hidden in a wash that blended seamlessly into the surrounding desert, accessible only by those who already knew it was there. She imagined Lena's bracelet lying in that darkness for decades, the silver slowly losing its shine, the engraved words waiting for someone to find them. Mara asked to see the accompanying field notes, and the officer slid a folder toward her. Inside were photographs of the cave interior, each image illuminated by the narrow cone of a headlamp beam. The walls bore faded ochre and red patterns, the intricate handprints and animal forms left by people who had lived in the region long before highways and roadside diners. The bracelet had been discovered just beyond a cluster of these markings, as if it had been dropped or placed there intentionally. Mara's fingers tightened on the folder as she tried to picture the moment it ended up in that spot. Had Lena been alive when it was lost? Or had someone else carried it there, a silent token left behind in a place meant to keep secrets? The sterile chill of the evidence room seemed to deepen as those questions circled in her mind. She slid the folder back across the table, thanked the officer, and stood for a moment, looking at the bracelet one last time. It was no longer just an artifact from a cave. It was a message from the past, and Mara knew she would have to follow it wherever it led. Mara found Rosa Villanueva living in a modest adobe house on the outskirts of Tucson, the kind of place where the paint on the window frames had faded under decades of desert sun and wind. Rosa, now in her late 50s, opened the door with cautious eyes, her dark hair streaked heavily with grey and pulled into a loose braid. At first, she claimed not to remember much about the summer of 1990, insisting that too many years had passed and too many faces had come and gone through the diner where she once worked. But as Mara gently laid a photograph of Lena on the kitchen table between them, the image of the 12-year-old girl with the bright smile seemed to unlock something in her. Rosa's gaze lingered on the picture before she sighed, her shoulders sinking as though shedding a weight she had carried for far too long. She admitted that on the day Lena vanished, she had stepped out to the back alley of the diner during a lull in the lunch rush, seeking a moment of air away from the clatter and heat of the kitchen. There, she had noticed a black pickup truck idling near the dumpster, its engine low and steady, the driver partially hidden in shadow beneath the brim of a baseball cap. He was motioning to someone, a quick flick of the fingers, the kind of gesture meant to look casual but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. When Rosa followed the line of his gaze, she saw Lena standing a few feet away, camera in hand, glancing between the man and something out of view. Rosa's instinct had been to step forward, to call out, but before she could, the girl had taken a few tentative steps in his direction. Rosa hesitated, her stomach tightening with unease, but fear quickly anchored her in place. At that time, everyone in the area knew that certain men and certain vehicles were tied to gangs that moved through the border towns, and those who asked questions often paid for it. Rosa told Mara she had convinced herself it was none of her business, that maybe the man was a family friend, or someone from the community. Within minutes, Lena was gone, and the truck was pulling away down the narrow service road. When the police came later, Rosa said nothing, afraid that speaking out would draw the wrong kind of attention. The guilt had stayed with her, a shadow that never left, but she had buried it under years of silence. Now, as Mara listened, Rosa's voice wavered, the regret thick in her words. She could not give a name, but she could describe the truck in detail, right down to a dent in the rear bumper and a sun-faded sticker on the tailgate. For Mara, it was a thin lead, but it was more than she had before, and it was enough to stir the feeling that the desert had not hidden every secret after all. The name hung in the air long after Rosa finished speaking, a faint tremor in her voice when she described the man in the black pickup truck. Mara had been taking careful notes, her pen gliding over the page with deliberate strokes, but when she heard the details of his face, the angular jaw, the faint scar along his left cheek, the way his eyes seemed to scan a place, even while speaking to someone, She felt a shiver of recognition. Later, back in her hotel room, she pulled out a worn leather folder she had carried for years, one that had belonged to her father, Ahmad. Inside were brittle pages of invoices, shipping manifests, and handwritten notes from a time she had rarely spoken about, documents that tied him loosely to men who operated in the shadowed economy of the early 1990s. It was there, in faded ink, that she saw the name, Javier Cortez. Her father had mentioned him once, only in passing, describing him as a man who knew every back road and unmarked crossing between Arizona and Mexico, someone equally at ease hauling crates of fruit or crates of contraband. The police in those years had known his name but never seemed able to pin him down. Mara's pulse quickened as she cross-checked the physical description against what Rosa had told her. It was almost too exact to be coincidence. She began searching through archived articles and police reports, piecing together fragments of a man who seemed to live on the edges of every investigation, but never at the center. Javier's name came up in connection with smuggling rings, stolen vehicles, and even a case of missing livestock in 1992. But he had a talent for disappearing whenever the law drew too close. Then, in the summer of 1996, his name stopped appearing altogether. Official records claimed he had died in what was described as a highway accident outside Hermosillo, but there were no photographs, no autopsy results in public files, and no witnesses willing to speak. Some believed he had been killed by rivals. Others swore they had seen him years later, living under a different name. For Mara, the revelation brought both clarity and frustration. If Javier had been the man in the truck that day, it could explain how Lena vanished so swiftly and why the trail had gone cold. But with him gone, there was no one left to answer the questions that mattered most. She sat at the small desk in her hotel room, the desert night pressing against the window, her fingers resting on the page where his name was written in her father's hand. It was a tenuous thread, frayed by time, but she could not shake the feeling that following it might pull loose something that had been hidden for 34 years. Somewhere in the silence between the past and present, she felt the faint stirrings of the truth. The road to Mateo's small dwelling wound through stretches of desert so quiet that even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stillness. Mara found him sitting beneath the shade of a mesquite tree, his skin weathered by years under the Arizona sun, his dark eyes sharp yet burdened by something unspoken. Mateo was Tohono O'odham, a man who had lived his entire life in the borderlands, and whose knowledge of the land went deeper than any map could show. At first, he spoke sparingly, his words measured, as though weighing whether Mara deserved the truths he had kept for decades. But when she showed him the photograph of Lena, her bright smile forever frozen at 12 years old, something in his expression shifted. He told her that in the summer of 1990, not long after a powerful monsoon had swept through the region, he had gone into one of the caves near the old trails to check for storm damage. Those caves, hidden among rocky outcrops, were known to his people for centuries, and few outsiders ever found them without guidance. As he approached the entrance, he noticed voices echoing faintly against the stone. He kept to the shadows, moving slowly until he could see the figures within. There were two men, both strangers to him, guiding a young girl deeper inside. She was small, with warm brown skin and black hair neatly braided down her back, but her steps were unsteady, her head tilting as though the world around her swayed. A length of cloth was tied around her ankles, loose enough for her to shuffle but not run. And though she did not cry out, Mateo saw the fear in her eyes when she glanced toward the cave mouth. He had known in that instant that she was not there by choice. Yet fear rooted him in place. In those years, the land was watched over not only by his own people, but by men with rifles and reputations. Smugglers who claimed certain paths as their own and punished those who interfered. Matteo had seen what happened to people who crossed them, so he backed away, careful to leave no trace, and told no one what he had witnessed. For years, the memory had weighed on him, surfacing in the quiet hours of the night when the desert was still and the stars hung low over the horizon. Now his voice wavered as he told Mara what he had kept locked inside. He could not say for certain the girl was Lena, but his description matched her in every way. He had not returned to that particular cave since, and the thought of it still brought a heaviness to his chest. Mara listened in silence, her pulse quickening, knowing that after 34 years of dead ends, this was the closest she had come to placing her sister somewhere real, somewhere tangible, even if that place was carved from darkness and fear. The deeper Mara dug into the archives, the more the cave began to take on a new and sinister dimension. What Matteo had described lingered in her mind, a dark image of a young girl being led away under the weight of fear, and it pressed her to search for records that might link the location to anything more than folklore. Days spent in the muted hum of the police records room yielded little at first, just dusty files and faded photographs of seizures involving crates of contraband or undocumented migrants intercepted along the border. But then, tucked inside a long-forgotten cabinet, she found a thick envelope marked with the words "Internal use only" in smudged blue ink. Inside was a sealed report dated to the summer of 1991, written just months after Lena's disappearance. The report detailed a sweep conducted by state and federal agents along an abandoned mining corridor not far from where the hidden cave lay. According to the field notes, officers had discovered traces of small garments in a collapsed section of a shaft, fragments of fabric that, upon inspection, appeared to be children's clothing. No bodies were found, and no official link was ever established between the garments and any active missing persons cases, but the language in the report was careful, almost evasive. There was no explanation for why the evidence was not tested further, and in the margins, someone had scribbled "low priority" beside the section describing the find. The mining corridor itself had a history that predated modern smuggling routes. It had once been used to move silver and copper ore, then later became an unspoken passage for illicit goods, and, as whispers suggested, for moving people. Mara traced the route on an old survey map, her finger following the winding line of tunnels and caves that ran parallel to lesser-known paths across the desert. The cave where the bracelet was found sat like a hidden hinge in the middle of that route. A place that could be easily overlooked yet was perfectly positioned to hide something, or someone, until it was safe to move them again. The realization settled into her bones with a cold certainty. Lena could have been held there, unseen, while the world above went on unaware. She imagined her sister's bracelet slipping from her wrist in that dark place, the engraving catching briefly in the dim light before disappearing into the sand for decades. Mara leaned back in her chair, staring at the file in front of her, anger simmering beneath her composure. Someone had known enough to write this report, to document what they had seen, and yet it had been buried, left to gather dust while families like hers were left to imagine every possibility but the truth. It was not just neglect. It was a silence that had been chosen, and that choice had kept Lena hidden for 34 years. When Mara called her younger brother Noel in Singapore, she expected the same polite but guarded responses he had given over the years whenever Lena's name came up. At 42, Noel had built a quiet life for himself, far from the desert roads where their family's story had shattered, working as an accountant in a firm where precision and predictability ruled each day. Yet when Mara's voice carried the weight of what she had learned, the bracelet, the cave, the old reports, something in his tone shifted. He hesitated, as though standing at the edge of a truth he had avoided for decades, and then he told her there was something she needed to know. In the final months before their father Ahmad disappeared from their lives, he had taken Noel aside one humid evening in their small Manila apartment. Noel had been only 18, but he could still recall the way Ahmad's eyes had looked that night, the exhaustion in them not just from years of labor, but from something deeper, a quiet surrender. Ahmad had told him that he believed Lena had been taken as a way to pressure him into paying off a debt he could not clear. The debt, Ahmad admitted, was tied to men who moved money and goods across the border without regard for the law, men who saw people as leverage. Ahmad had been approached, and when he refused to cooperate, they made an unspoken but chilling move. Lena vanished. He had convinced himself in those first desperate days that she would be returned unharmed once they realized he could not pay, that the threat alone would be enough to scare him into submission. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and she never came back. That mistake, Ahmad told Noel, had been his greatest failure, one that gnawed at him until the day he left for Malaysia and never returned. Noel confessed to Mara that he had kept this to himself all these years, partly out of shame, partly out of a futile hope that by burying it, they could bury the pain. But hearing her speak now of caves, of smuggling routes, of names like Javier Cortez, made the silence feel like a betrayal. Mara listened without interrupting, her pen still in her hand, though she had stopped taking notes, letting the weight of his words settle between them. She could hear the regret in Noel's voice, the years of what-ifs that had shaped the way he lived, cautious and careful, never straying too close to danger. When they hung up, Mara sat for a long time with the phone in her lap, staring out the window at the fading light. Her father's decision, his refusal, and the shadow it cast, had shaped everything that followed. Now she carried not just her own determination to find the truth, but the ghost of his guilt as well. The photograph was tucked between two unrelated reports, as though it had been misplaced or intentionally hidden, its edges curled and its surface dulled by time. Mara found it while combing through a stack of old case files in the dimly lit records room, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound in the still air. It was a Polaroid, the kind that developed in the palm of your hand, the colors now faded into a muted palette of browns and yellows. In the center stood a teenage girl, her hair long and black, falling in loose waves around a face that made Mara's breath catch. The shape of the eyes, the tilt of the jaw, even the faint curve of her mouth. They all pulled at something deep in her memory, the image overlapping perfectly with her recollections of Lena. The file it was clipped to contained details of a raid conducted in the spring of 1993 on a suspected safe house near the border. The operation had been tied to an investigation into human trafficking networks believed to be moving people through Arizona into Mexico. Several adults had been taken into custody, but the paperwork noted only in passing that a young girl, approximately 15 or 16, had been found on the premises and removed from the scene before officers could question her. The report did not say where she had been taken or who had claimed her. The girl in the Polaroid stood against a plain wall, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed just off camera. She wore a pale dress that looked too large for her frame, the hem frayed and the fabric creased, as though it had been worn for days. There was a stillness to her posture, not the stiffness of fear, but the heavy quiet of someone who had learned to make themselves small. Mara studied the photograph for a long time, her mind trying to bridge the years between the smiling 12-year-old in family pictures and this older, wearier face. Could this be Lena, 3 years after the day she vanished? The possibility sent a rush of heat through her, a fragile hope colliding with the knowledge that the trail was decades cold. She searched the file for any follow-up, any attempt to identify the girl, but there was nothing, just a blank space where answers should have been. The Polaroid, it seemed, had been filed away and forgotten, its subject lost once more to time. Mara slipped the photograph into a protective sleeve and set it gently on the table beside her notes. If it was Lena, then someone had seen her alive 3 years after she disappeared, and that meant the silence surrounding her fate was not from ignorance, but from choice. The thought settled heavily on her chest, fueling a determination that had never truly dimmed. The cave was even more foreboding in person than it had appeared in the photographs, its narrow entrance framed by jagged rock and shadow, the air around it cool despite the heat pressing down on the desert. Mara stood with the specialized rescue team at the base of the wash, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound as they prepared their equipment. The team moved with practiced precision, clipping harnesses, checking ropes, and adjusting headlamps before they began the slow descent into the darkness. Inside, the passage quickly narrowed, forcing them to stoop and shift sideways, their lights casting moving patterns across the rough limestone walls. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of minerals and age, as though it had been sealed away for centuries. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the occasional scrape of gear against stone. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they reached a chamber deeper than the one where the bracelet had been found. It was here, in the beam of a searchlight, that the first fragment of fabric appeared. A scrap of faded cotton caught on a jagged outcrop, its edges frayed as if it had been torn in haste. Not far from it lay a child's shoe, its leather cracked and curling, the laces stiff with age. Mara crouched to examine it, her chest tightening as she imagined a small foot once inside, running, stumbling, or perhaps being carried. Then one of the team members called out, his voice echoing off the walls. He had found an old leather satchel, half collapsed under the weight of dust and debris. Its surface was scuffed, the stitching worn, but the clasp still held. Mara knelt beside it, brushing away the sand before carefully opening it. Inside were a few unremarkable items, a rusted key, a broken pen, and a single boarding pass stub, yellowed and brittle. She held it up to the light, her breath catching when she saw the date, 1991. The ink had blurred over time, and the passenger's name was partially smudged, but the first two letters were clear enough to make her pulse race. Lee. It could mean nothing, she told herself, but the possibility burned in her mind. She imagined Lena clutching that satchel, the boarding pass a link to somewhere she might have been taken, perhaps across the border, perhaps further still. The chamber felt smaller with each passing second, the weight of what they were finding pressing in on her. Every artifact was a whisper from the past, a fragment of a story that had never been told. As they packed the items carefully into evidence bags, Mara knew these discoveries would change the scope of the investigation. The cave was no longer just a place where her sister's bracelet had been found. It was a tomb of hidden truths, and it had just begun to give them up. The call came late in the evening, when the desert sky outside Mara's hotel window had turned the color of cooling embers and the streets below were settling into quiet. The woman's voice on the other end was hesitant at first, her accent carrying the soft cadences of Southeast Asia, each word chosen with care. She introduced herself as Amira and explained that she had been given Mara's number by a contact who believed they were searching for the same truth. Amira's story unfolded slowly, as if each memory she pulled forward carried its own weight. She had been rescued from a trafficking ring in the early 2000s, but the years before her rescue had been scattered between places she could not always name, moved like cargo between hands she could never trust. In the summer of 1991, when she was still a teenager, she had been held in a remote compound in the desert, somewhere beyond the reach of paved roads. It was there, she said, that she met a girl named Lena. She remembered her as small for her age, with dark eyes that seemed older than the rest of her, and a voice that carried the quiet resilience of someone who refused to break. They were only together for a short time, their conversations stolen in whispers when the guard's attention was elsewhere. Lena had spoken little about where she had come from, but she mentioned a sister, and the way she said the word carried a depth that stayed with Amira all these years. One night, Lena had confided her plan to escape, describing a moment when the guards' routine would shift and she could slip away. Amira admitted she had been too afraid to follow, her body too weakened by the life they had been forced into. A day later, Lena was gone, and the guards were in a frenzy. They did not speak openly about what had happened, but Amira overheard fragments that Lena had made it into the desert, that she had been caught in the heat, that her body had been placed in a shallow cave chamber far from the compound. The tone in their voices had carried no remorse, only the satisfaction of a loose end tied up. Amira had carried that memory with her through her rescue, through the years of recovery, but it had taken hearing about the bracelet's discovery to compel her to speak. As she told Mara all this, her voice trembled, the grief in it raw even after decades. Mara sat in silence when the call ended, her hands curled tightly in her lap, the details pressing into her like stones. There was pain in knowing her sister's end might have come so close to freedom, but there was also a strange gratitude in having this fragment of her story. Lena had not simply vanished into nothing, she had fought to escape, and someone had remembered. The interview room was dim, lit only by the yellow glow of a single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the table where Mara sat across from the man. He was in his late 60s now, his once broad frame thinned by time, his skin weathered like old leather, and his eyes carrying the dullness of someone who had spent too many years inside prison walls. This was the man the police had quietly called in after Amira's testimony, a former smuggler whose name had appeared again and again in the background of cases from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s. At first, he answered questions with the deliberate vagueness of someone who had learned how to survive interrogations, his tone a mix of resignation and defiance. But when Mara slid the photograph of the bracelet across the table, along with a copy of the boarding pass stub from 1991, something in his expression changed. His fingers hesitated over the paper, and a deep sigh escaped him, one that seemed to carry the weight of years. Slowly, he began to talk. He confirmed what Amira had told her, that Lena had tried to escape one blistering afternoon and had almost made it to open desert before collapsing from heat and exhaustion. The men who found her did not take her back to the compound. Instead, under orders from Javier Cortez, they carried her to a section of the cave system known only to a few. Javier had called it the second chamber, a place deeper in than most would dare to go, its entrance disguised behind a curtain of rock and narrow enough that only someone who knew its exact location would find it. There, they had placed her body, wrapping it in cloth and leaving it in the darkness, believing that no one would ever discover it. The smuggler leaned back in his chair as he described the route, his voice flat, but his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room. He gave precise directions, the number of steps after the main chamber, the jagged rock shaped like a crouching animal that marked the narrow passage, the drop in temperature that would tell them they were close. He spoke of it without embellishment, as if stating simple facts, but Mara could hear the faint tremor beneath his words, the knowledge of what he had been part of. When he finished, the room was silent except for the slow ticking of the wall clock. Mara felt her chest tighten, her mind already tracing the path he had described, picturing the second chamber and what they might find there. The smuggler looked at her then, his voice low as he said he had carried this for too long and that perhaps it was time for someone to bring her home. It was not an apology, but it was the closest she would ever get. The morning the search team set out for the cave again, the air over the desert was cool and still, the kind of rare calm that seemed to hold its breath before giving way to heat. Mara walked alongside the team, the smuggler's directions committed to memory, every detail etched into her mind, as if she had rehearsed the journey for years. The entrance to the second chamber was exactly where he had said it would be, hidden behind a jagged wall of stone that blended so completely into its surroundings that even standing inches away, it appeared to be nothing more than solid rock. The passage was tight, forcing them to move slowly, their headlamps casting shifting halos of light that revealed walls slick with moisture and dust undisturbed for decades. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended into the chamber, and the air took on a stillness that made every sound feel magnified. It was there, in a pocket of earth and stone, that they found her. The remains were wrapped in faded cloth, the edges fraying and brittle, and beside them lay a small camera, its metal body dulled but intact. Inside, a roll of film had somehow survived, sealed away from light all these years. Mara's hands shook as she held it, the thought of what images it might hold both thrilling and breaking her heart. When the team emerged from the cave hours later, the sun was high and the wind had picked up, scattering fine sand across their path. The remains were transferred with care into the custody of forensic specialists who would finally give Lena a name in the records after 34 years of absence. Days later, under the pale light of dawn, Surya stood at her daughter's graveside, the desert stretching endlessly behind her. In her hands, she held the silver bracelet, its engraving worn but still clear. For Lena, love, Mum. The wind tugged at her scarf, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and creosote, and her tears fell freely, mixing with the dust at her feet. Mara stood beside her, the weight of the camera in her bag a constant reminder that pieces of Lena's story were still waiting to be revealed. As the small gathering of friends and supporters stepped back to give them space, Surya pressed the bracelet to her lips before placing it gently on the fresh mound of earth. Mara's gaze was fixed on the horizon, her voice steady as she promised her mother that this would not be the end, that the network which had taken Lena and so many others would be exposed, its shadows brought into the light. She knew the work ahead would be dangerous and exhausting, but she also knew that silence was no longer an option. Lena's story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to every family who had ever waited for someone who never came home, and Mara would not let it be forgotten.